Yes, I hear you. We can start? Okay. Let me... good morning to all in this part of the world. Good afternoon in Europe. Good evening for those in Asia. Good afternoon also for those in Africa and the Middle East. Let me say I'm Jose Antonio Campo, the chair of this session. I am from Colombia, the country, but a professor at Columbia University in New York. And in relation to the issues that we're going to discuss today, let me say that I'm the chair of the United Nations Committee for Development Policy, which is in charge of the following on establishing the criteria for LDCs, what countries are considered or graduate from LDC status, and then to do a support and follow up of the graduation process. Let me say as an introduction that the issue of the financial needs of LDCs had been, of course, a major issue for decades, and certainly prior to the current COVID-19 crisis. But the COVID-19 certainly increased the financial needs of these countries. UNCTAD, for example, in its recent LDC report, estimated financial needs for fixed investments in LDCs to achieve the key SDGs with an average growth that is required of 7%, and then poverty eradication by 2030 would require almost $2 trillion per year, which is 3 times higher than the current amount of fixed investments. Most LDCs have limited domestic resources, making them reliant on international resources. However, most of the FDI and blended international financial flows to other developing countries fail to reach many LDCs. Hence, official development assistance and support from multilateral development banks and some forms of private financing are particularly important. In the study that we presented to ECOSOC, on the impact of COVID-19 on LDCs. We found out that in the area of financing, some form of debt service suspension has been useful, but much more is required. Well, November of last year, the G20 launched a new initiative in this area, allowing the case-by-case renegotiation of the debts of LDCs, but this is, of course, an issue that many more LDCs will require. Over the years, we have also highlighted the need for domestic and international policies to harness foreign direct investment and remittances, and to create sound macroeconomic and financial policy frameworks to increase domestic resources. So I'm looking forward to hearing the experiences and views on the ground and from the international organizations on these issues. It's a very interesting and diverse panel that will focus on both domestic and international resources and public and private financing. Let me, of course, underscore that given the amount of panelists, I will really hope that each one of you will take only up to 7 minutes for your presentations. Then we will have at the end, if that is possible, a session of questions from the audience. Having said that, let me first give the floor to Ms. Aneta Kubik, Senior Researcher at the Center for Development Research in the University of Bonn, who is going to speak of foreign direct investments in the African food and agriculture sector. You have the floor, Aneta.
Thank you very much. Let me share the screen. Okay, perfect. So I will now just very briefly discuss my work on foreign direct investment in the African food and agriculture sector. So over the last decade, we could observe a revived interest in the food and agriculture sector, both from policymakers as well as researchers, and mainly due to the importance of this sector for food security in many countries. At the political level, several multi-stakeholder initiatives have been launched in order to boost investment in the sector, including G20 Compact with Africa or the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. The food and agriculture sector in Africa is undergoing a profound transformation, moving away from subsistence-oriented to more commercialized food systems. And it also gives a growing weight to the off-farm activities such as processing, marketing, and retail. And a common feature of this transformation is the rapidly growing importance of the private sector. At the same time, the prospects for the agro-industrial sector in Africa are really promising, considering especially the rapidly growing demand, both locally and internationally, and also shifting consumption patterns. However, important investments are still necessary to keep pace with this growing demand. Capital investment levels in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa are still much lower compared to other regions, and also much below what is required to bring African agriculture to its full potential. So in principle, FDI has the potential to fill this gap. However, to this day, Africa only receives slightly more than 10% of the world FDI in food and agriculture. A few stylized facts. So a total of close to $49 billion was invested in the African food and agriculture sector over the period 2003-17. And almost half of this was invested just in the fertilizer sector, and around 27 billion US dollars in other subsectors which are directly related to food production. So in this presentation, I will focus on the latter. The two figures you see here show FDI inflows in the sector measured in terms of capital investment on the left-hand side and number of deals on the right-hand side. The figures suggest that FDI inflows in the food and agriculture sector in Africa broadly followed the worldwide trends, in that they were rather low before 2007 when the prices of agricultural commodities were low. And then that was followed by a rapid increase in 2008-09 and corresponded to the boom in agricultural commodities. We can also observe a growing importance of FDI flows from the global south, especially 3 countries from the global south figure among the top 10 investors, and these are India, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. There are considerable differences in investment flows between countries, as you can see on this map. So the highest amount of capital was invested in Nigeria, then Egypt, Cameroon, South Africa, and Ghana. Also, because of the expected positive impacts of these investments in terms of food security and poverty reduction, it might be of interest in this forum to see where the LDCs stand in terms of food and agriculture FDI. Only $8 billion were invested in LDCs over this period 2003-17, and this is around 25% of total inflows to Africa. But there exists a wide variety or disparity among LDCs as well. So 3 LDCs count among the top 10 host countries, and this is Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. But at the same time, 10 LDCs received 0 food and agriculture FDI over that period of time. While going into details of the methodology adopted in the paper on which these findings are based is probably not of much interest in this forum, let me just say that it draws on the large theoretical literature on FDI, and the analysis as such employs both like standard econometric methods as well as spatial econometrics. What we could see based on the results is that foreign investors appear to be really responsive to global and regional developments in the food and agriculture sector, especially in terms of food prices. However, the African market also becomes intrinsically attractive for foreign investors in light of the transformation that the local food system has been undergoing. So the findings show that investments are driven mainly by the potential that a domestic consumer class represents, not only in the host country, but also in neighboring countries. In terms of purchasing power of the host country, investment decisions appear to be more forward-looking and driven by future prospects rather than current opportunities. So it is not necessarily countries with higher incomes that receive more FDI inflows, but rather countries with higher income growth. Our findings also provide evidence of the importance of supply-side factors, and these include countries' natural endowments in infrastructure. In particular, availability of agricultural land is an essential incentive for foreign investors in the allocation decision. The evidence is particularly strong in case of FDI flows originating from the global north. While this finding might seem to go in line with the debates on the often controversial large-scale investments in farmland in Africa, I think it is important to note that contrary to popular perceptions, investment in crop production constitute a very small share of total FDI inflows in the food and in agriculture sector because it's only 10%. Then institutional factors such as governance and tax incentives also matter for prospective investors. Finally, the results provide evidence for the existence of spatial dependencies in foreign investment between countries, whereby foreign investors account not only for the opportunities offered by the host country, but also by neighboring countries. However, the evidence is strong only in case of FDI flows originating from the global north. Foreign investment in the food and agriculture sector in Africa took form of regional export platforms, where investment in the host country is used as a platform to serve nearby countries as well. And for that reason, market potential of neighboring countries becomes a significant predictor of FDI inflows in the host country, as well as lower cross-border trade costs. I think this is in line really with the recent trends of the global value chains reconfiguration and the increasing importance of regional value chains. So what kind of policy implications can these findings?
Excuse me, Saneta, can you try to conclude your presentation?
Okay, this is the last. So despite improvements, Africa still receives only a small share of the global food and beverages FDI, and especially the recent COVID-19 crisis made it very clear. However, I think what is important is to know that even though structural factors play a decisive role in FDI allocation decision of foreign investors, appropriate policies and public investments can help overcome these structural disadvantages. So improving these factors can not only encourage FDI inflows, but will also have the potential to create conditions under which these investments can benefit the society as a whole. I think I can conclude here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Saneta. By the way, I think your presentation underscores the relevance, I guess, or rather the possibilities generated by rising prices now, but also the very great challenge of regional integration in Africa as an instrument of increasing investment in food and agriculture. Now I give the floor to Pierre Mambondu. Sorry if I am mispronouncing your name. He is a researcher at the University of Réunion, and he was going to speak about the VAT and the reduction of inequalities and poverty in Burkina Faso. You have the floor, Pierre.
First of all, I would like to thank the committee for this opportunity to share with you this research. But if I want to respect the allocated time, I must switch in French, so please use the translator. L'objectif donc de ce travail de recherche est de mettre en évidence.
The objective of this research work is to show how the VAT impact can also have an effect on gender inequalities and food safety to a certain extent in a number of countries. And here we're looking at Burkina Faso. This was done within a doctoral project with a professor of economy in the Université de Normandie. I shall say a few words about context, literature, the methodology and data, and then the key results. Now, regarding the context, we know that about 40% of the population in Burkina Faso is poor, and this is compounded by a certain number of factors. Women are less present on the job market, they're not as well paid, and they also work mainly in the least productive sectors. And it is also women who have to carry the burden of domestic work, which will reduce the possibility for them to take part in commercial activities. So in order to change things, the government set up a development plan. However, there is the problem, which is that of mobilizing resources. So we have to see how, with the own resources, we can try to reform in order to enhance the country's capacity. and to see, we need to see whether the impact of that reform will not compound inequalities and poverty. So we have used a general model. Briefly, it is a model which shows how an exogenous shock, such as the VAT, can impact the situation of economic agents. So what are the channels we are looking at, and what policies have we simulated? Well, it's a recommendation of the IMF, which says to the Burkina Faso government, try to mobilize more domestic resources. And in order to do that, you will have to take a look at your VAT system, because there are quite a few exemptions. So try for 5% VAT rate. And then there are exemptions for everything which is energy, electricity, etc. So try to bring back VAT down to the legal rate of 18% on water and electricity. Now, this policy, when it is implemented, it has an impact on the country, except that the positive impact on GDP will benefit mainly businesses which are male work intensive, and there are sectors which will be less well served, where there are mainly women. Agriculture, with a drop in local demand, and we've observed an increase of prices in the country.
This takes us to observe women's situation more precisely. Their household chores increase and the paid work decreases. So this type of measure does not reduce inequality. And with a decrease in wages, there's a rise in precariousness. So this measure increases public resources, but it worsens the situation of the poorest households. So what can be done? Here is our proposition. Support the reform with targeted allocations for the poorest families. Second idea, maybe if the money is put to good use by reinvesting it, there can be positive effects. For instance, if you reinvest the money in agriculture, you can mitigate the impacts on the sector. And although gender inequality is decreasing in the formal workplace, inequality are still stable in the household because women are still in charge of the chores. So it is essential to invest in farming and services where women are most highly concentrated. And it is also essential to invest in infrastructure, for instance, water, electricity, because that will alleviate the chores for women who are often responsible for fetching wood, for instance. So this is a proposition that allows to increase public finances without increasing the debt, while mitigating the potential negative effects of such measures. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your time discipline, which was excellent. I think this is a very important point. I mean, the 2 points. I mean, how you collect and use the fiscal resources as a major instrument of cooperation, and the gender dimensions that you have underscored in your presentation. Now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Olivier Cataneo, the head of the Policy Analysis and Strategy Unit at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, who is going to speak about the financing the transition to sustainable development in the LDCs. You have the floor, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I will try to share my screen. Here you go. Is it working for you? Good. So thanks a lot for the invitation and for the opportunity to present this paper. I mean, co-authored with my colleagues, I mean, Cecilia Piemonte and Abdoulaye Fabregas on transition finance in LDCs. And I will take a step back, I mean, from previous presentations to look at the big picture of financing sustainable development and present you our methodology that basically looks, I mean, it's all summarized on this graph, at how different sources of financing, both domestic and external, substitute and evolve as the countries become richer. You look, for instance, at the blue line that is going down, that's ODA, official development assistance, the green is private finance, the dotted line and the right axis, I mean, are domestic resources. And you see a progressive substitution of external by domestic finance and of public by private finance. Of course, this substitution doesn't happen at the same time, I mean, in all sectors. And we are looking, I mean, at the sectoral level, at the stage, for instance, here of substitution of concessional and non-concessional finance. And you see that this happens very early in some sectors, like banking, business, or production, but very late in other sectors, like the social sectors. Now, turning to the implications, I mean, through the pilot studies that we have done, I mean, in the LDCs, we see three main challenges. I mean, the first one is that graduating LDCs are often faced, I mean, with multiple transitions and that they have to handle at the same time. I mean, for instance, they go from low-income country to a low-middle-income country. They also exit some concessional windows or funds like IDA, Gavis, access to private capital markets, and so on. And the combination of all those transitions, I mean, might make the task of graduation even harder, knowing that there are always risks of setbacks. The second challenge, I mean, we see in our study is that the LDCs struggle more than other countries to achieve a smooth transition between different sources of financing. On the right-hand side is for non-LDCs, that is very similar to what I've shown you previously with the different curves. On the left-hand side is for LDCs, and you see that the curves are flat, which means that whatever the level of income of the LDCs, they face the same difficulties to mobilize domestic resources and private finance. So the risk is, and here I give you the example of social sectors, is that when you graduate and when you transition, you face what we call a transition finance gap, which means that the substitution between the concessional and non-concessional, like on this picture, is not perfect, and you're left with a huge gap to finance through domestic resource mobilization. The third challenge is the one of debt that has already been evoked here, and that, again, I wanted to emphasize. And here on the left-hand side, this is exacerbated from our transition pilot in Capo Verde, and you see that very often in LDCs after graduation, there is a surge in the debt level, of course, because there is less concessionality. The conditions are different as you move to private sector funding. This has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and here you have the number of LDCs, I mean, that are in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. And of course, this high debt burden affects the capacities of LDCs to respond to the COVID-19 crisis and to recover. So in terms of policy recommendations, to conclude on my last slide, on the way forward also to Doha and LDC 5, I mean, I would like to focus on 3 points. I mean, the first one is that in the follow-up of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, I mean, we need to integrate this holistic approach, I mean, to financing sustainable development into the diagnostics. And this is also what is done as part of the INFFs. We really look at all the different sources of financing and how they articulate and how they can best leverage each other. The second point is that we see that the landscape of financing sustainable development is increasingly complex and evolving very quickly. And we see it with the sustainability bonds, with the debt swaps, and lots of new products that emerge in our countries. We counted as more than 2,000 instruments to choose from, and that's extremely difficult. And sometimes that means renouncing to accessing some funds like the green funds. And so we propose to pool all technical assistance and capacity building efforts into one mechanism to help developing countries and LDCs in particular be able to navigate this complex FFD landscape. And finally, the last point is to help the substitution of public by private financing. And we are working around strengthening the development cooperation investment trade nexus. We need to rethink and revamp, I think, the Aid for Trade initiative to take into consideration and new evolutions of trade, I mean, with digitalizations, with global value chains, and all the opportunities that we bring, and not only focus on market access, preferential treatment, and so on. And we need to rethink that for the LDCs in particular. So I will leave it here, Chair, with my 7 minutes, and thanks again.
Well, thanks again for this very interesting presentation about the challenges generated by the changes in the composition of financing to meet the international targets, as well as the debt issues, which I also mentioned in my initial remarks. I think this is a very important point. That let me also underscore, based on your graphs, the importance of official development assistance, which is, of course, the issue that you manage in the area in the OECD. Now, I now give the floor to Florence Muleja, the Chief Executive Officer of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, who is going to speak about the allure of commercial debt, the case of Zambia and Mozambique. You have the floor, Florence. Sorry, you are not online? Okay.
Beam it, my presentation from there, or I can beam it from my side.
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we see you now very well. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let me just share my video now. Sorry, my presentation. Right. Good afternoon once again. I hope you can all see my presentation. My name is Florence Mulea from the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, as has been said, in Zambia. And my study or my research centered around the allure of commercial debt in least development countries. And I looked at two countries, Zambia and Mozambique. The two countries struck as interesting cases to study because Zambia was the first country to fail to meet its obligations in the period of COVID. and Mozambique by then had already defaulted. So I was just trying to see what lessons Zambia would learn from Mozambique in ensuring that as it goes ahead with traversing this debt landscape, what would happen. So as at 2020, there were 5 countries that were acclaimed to be at high risk of debt. And these included the Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Eritrea, and Zambia. Whilst Mozambique was also at a high risk of debt distress, it had already defaulted. And so, as I had explained, for me, this became an interesting picture to understand what lessons will be learned for a country like Zambia to proceed in its traversing of the debt landscape. And so what we see there is a situation in which from round about 2010, the gross national income of Zambia was quite high, the line in green, and this started to dissipate in 2015. But it was round about the same time, starting from about 2012, 2013, that the debt, which is in blue, started to increase at quite a fast rate. And so what we saw was that the percentage of debt to gross national income increased rapidly from 2013 to 2016, though this decreased in 2017, as shown by the dotted line in orange. We found that the percentage of GDP, the percentage of external debt to GDP was close to 70%. And whilst all this was happening, the debt service was also increasing in relation to the amount of exports that Zambia was generating. And some of the effects of this external debt was that inflation increased rapidly, with Zambia targeting inflation between 6 to 8%. We saw a steep increase of inflation round about the period in 2018, and inflation broke this range that had been targeted by the government. We also saw quite substantial crowding out effects on the private sector because the government started then to borrow more domestically, and this was being used to help fund the budget, because most of the monies that were being generated from revenues were being utilized to pay out debt. There was macro instability where the interest rates, the exchange rates and everything. So, for example, the exchange rates depreciated quite rapidly, whereas the interest rates were high and elevated to almost like 24 to 25%. And also in the country, there was reduced liquidity. The government also started to fail to pay its monies that it was owing to suppliers of goods and services, such as the private sector. So this picture here just depicts this crowding out effects that I mentioned before. The blue line is what private sector would borrow from the domestic markets, but the red line, we started to see that steep increase of the government borrowing from the domestic markets, and that's reducing how much the private sector could collect. So what really caused Zambia to get to this position? So we know that in 2011, Zambia was declared a low middle income country. And what this meant is that, one, it would not only have less access to concessional debt, but also that it had freedom to go into the concessional markets. But whilst this happened, the country did not have the institutional and legal framework that would allow it to ensure that even as it borrows more, there is a framework to ensure that the debt proceeds are used correctly. And with this, we saw an expansionary fiscal policy that came in with the regime that really wanted to ensure that the infrastructure development programs that it had put on the agenda would go ahead. And so with the freedom to go into the commercial markets, we saw debt increase, external debt increase quite rapidly. Mozambique, on the other hand, had already gone into the external markets, and as at 2013, there were quite a number of debts that the government guaranteed on behalf of three state-owned enterprises. But what this resulted in was that in 2015, after some external shocks, the GDP drastically reduced, and the debt therefore became much more than even the amount of GDP that was being generated in the country. And there we saw the percentage of the debt going above 100% and was as high as close to 120% of the GDP, whilst the exports were not performing very well. And so the debt service ratio to exports was also quite high. And for Mozambique, as at 2018, we see that their debt to public sector debt to GDP stood at about 110%. But what is interesting there is that we see that what was going into guarantees was going to the state-owned enterprises, and we have an increase from about 9.5% in 2014 to about 2016, 11.2, and this is the period in which the hidden debts were kind of like revealed. And so the information came to broad daylight, and they had to reveal that actually the debts that were guaranteed were as high as 5.7% of GDP on one individual company. So some of the causes of Mozambique's default.
Can you finish your presentation, because we have a shortage of time? Thank you.
Not a problem. So with the issues of the natural disasters and the limited control on the SMEs, on the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, we saw the real exchange rate depreciation in Mozambique really depreciate. And the allure really was coming from the fact that legislative and institutional building capacities that come from institutions such as the IMF and World Bank were quite onerous on these companies. So they thought it best to go to bilateral creditors whose conditions were not as tough as the international organizations, and their accessibility into the international capital markets made it possible for them to increase their debt. So some of the debt refinancing options, as a lesson from Mozambique that Zambia has, that it could either buy back the bond as it stands, because Zambia's first bond, which is due in 2022, stands at $1 million, but in the market, it is rated somewhere around 500,000 to 750, the increase happening just in the last 2 weeks. So if the bond could be bought back, then Zambia would pay much less than the 1 million, but this would mean that it would need a substantial amount of money. If the IMF deal could come on, then they would be able to pay back. They could also refinance the Eurobond as was done by Mozambique, or the other option would be to roll it over. But really the major issues that arise from here and the recommendations is that LDCs need to find that critical balance between fiscal consolidation efforts currently and the need to overcome the deficit in infrastructure. Of course, the macro fiscal risks need to be managed adequately, and implementation of new regulatory framework that allows them to manage public investment as well as debt. And public investment should be prioritized in those areas that have got high economic returns. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Florence. Again, you raised the major issue of debt, also underscored by Olivier and my initial remarks, and also very importantly, this very difficult transition towards commercial financing or private sector financing, which many countries have faced in the past. I mean, coming from Latin America, this was a major issue, of course, in the debt crisis of the 1980s. Let me now give the floor to Mariana Jallet-Doré, the Development Finance Lead and Director of Research and Analysis Development Initiatives, a very interesting organization producing excellent information on these issues, who is going to speak about reversing the trends that leaves the LDCs behind. You have the floor, Mariana.
Screen. I think with that. So thank you very much for the introduction. So my presentation is about the current trends that leave LDCs behind and actually what we can do to reverse those trends. And in particular in this presentation, we look at the financing landscape in LDCs and emphasize the role of official development assistance, as it was already done in the previous meeting, in these countries, and the challenges that ODA currently faces as a global financing source of finance. So we know that ODA is also a scarce resource which needs to be used wisely, and it faces competing priorities today more than ever. Particularly, there's an issue of where to be best spent. There's this competing priorities such as climate change, global health, and country-specific needs. And what I'll show during this presentation is that historically, non-country specific aid, which basically means aid that is not allocated to any specific country, has actually grown much faster than country-specific aid. And in addition, ODA to LDC specifically has not grown at the same rate as ODA to other developing countries. And it only in the last couple of years that it started catching up. Furthermore, this pattern of ODA allocation doesn't really not reflect global trends in poverty and distributions, which basically show that extreme poverty is increasingly concentrated in LDCs. So that's exactly where I'm starting my presentation. So LDCs account for a disproportionate share of people of recent poverty increases. So in 2020, LDCs accounted for 14% of the global population. However, they were home to a quarter of people pushed back into poverty during the pandemic, and 50% of these people living in extreme poverty below the 1%, $1 a day, actually live in LDCs. This percentage was much lower in 2010, where basically extreme poverty has 29% rate in LDCs. So we see also there's a gap in domestic public finance between LDCs and other developing countries. So we see that even before the pandemic, the gap between LDCs and other developing countries was already growing, as measured by non-grant government revenues. But the growth was relatively flat, as it shows in the graphic. Development initiatives projections actually suggest that the resource gap will be even bigger between LDCs and other developing countries. So it will grow much more again after the pandemic. And we see, as we've seen in our presentations before, that debt service is actually taking a greater share of scarce domestic resources in LDCs. So debt service as a percentage of non-grant government revenue has actually more than doubled in the last decade, from 7.4% in 2010 to 20.7% in 2019. And this is because LDCs have been increasingly assessing non-traditional and also non-concessional sources of financing. But if we look particularly at what happened in aid, then we know that in 2019, donors have lent $16.7 billion to LDCs, and more than a quarter of this was actually going to countries in high risk of debt distress, or actually debt distress, as mentioned before. And this is according to latest IMF estimates. So these risks actually debt crisis among LDCs. So in the context of constrained financing with significant and growing demands because of the pandemic, we see that external resources are critical. However, LDCs capture a very small proportion of international flows, as we've seen already today, compared with other developing countries. And of course, the lack of resources that is using and critical impact and implications LDC, which you cover in more detail in our paper. Many of these flows were actually reduced during the pandemic, in particular FDI and remittances. They fell substantial in 2020. And although we see in the graphic that LDCs received nearly 44% of official development assistance that was allocated to specific countries, recent seeds have seen substantially grown, which is not allocated to any particular countries, which is what I'm going to show next. So as we can see here in the figure, non-country specific official development assistance has actually grown by nearly 50% over the last decade. And this is particularly as a result of donors spending increased amounts of money on refugees within their own borders. And non-country specific aid has also grown at a faster rate than aid to LDCs or other developing countries. And what worries us is that this trend actually continue to happen, but of course driven by other factors such as global health and the pandemic. When looking at overall official development assistance, including non-country specific disbursements, we see that LDCs only receive a 29% share in 2019, and this is down from 32% in 2010. So we see that basically the share of people living in extreme poverty has increased in LDCs, and they're getting a lower share of official development assistance. And this trend is projected to continue. In other words, LDCs have been receiving a lower share of aid than the proportion of extreme poverty that they represent. And we know that 40 years ago, in 1981, there was a substantial new program of action for LDCs where donor countries committed to provide aid equivalent to 0.15 to 0.2% of their own GNI to LDCs. And unfortunately, only a handful number of donors have actually met the target each year. So just to sum up some key takeaways, we know that LDCs face a long road to recovery, more so than other developing countries, including in financing that recovery. And official development assistance has, and particularly concessional finance, has a vital role to play in these countries in order to ensure a fair and more equitable recovery. It may only be a small resource, but it's actually a critical resource in these countries. Aid is actually the largest external resources, external financing flows in LDCs. However, we saw this in this presentation that non-country specific aid has grown much faster than country-specific aid. And this trend might indeed continue due to the global and competing priorities of aid between tackling global challenges, climate or global health, and country-specific needs. And of the country-specific aid, we see also that aid to LDCs has not grown at the same rate as aid to other developing countries. And furthermore, we see that aid allocations actually do not reflect global trends in poverty, which show basically that extreme poverty has been increasingly concentrated in LDCs. So this leaves LDCs on average on a well-off track to meet the SDGs, with a number of people still living in poverty and of course a growing divergence between LDCs, other developing countries, and of course the rest of the world. So I think this is a kind of a call for action. As the international community prepares for this 5th LDC conference, I think there's an opportunity to actually shift this trajectory. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for your very nice presentation, Mariana. Let me, of course, underscore again the central role of ODA. And as you have pointed out, the reallocation of ODA towards refugees and other internal problems that face developed countries is certainly a major issue, as well as the inadequate allocation, which is an old problem that the ODA or the official development assistance world have faced for a long time. Now, I'll give the floor now to Theogen Segijumba. I'm sorry for mispronouncing certainly your name. Is economic planner at University of Burundi, who is going to speak about financing micro enterprises in Burundi. You have the floor.
Hello, bonjour.
Go ahead, please.
Hello. Bonjour, moi c'est Eugène Sengyonva du Burundi. Est-ce que vous voyez la...
From Burundi. Can you see my presentation?
No, we can see you, but not your presentation.
Alors, je reprends la présentation.
Just give me a moment. I will share my screen.
Yes, now we can see it. Okay.
Dropped out. Yeah, he dropped.
Jose Antonio, could you go to the next speaker because we don't have him now?
Okay, very good. So I give the floor now to Daniel Gay, who is actually the advisor to our UN Committee for Development Policy, who is going to make a presentation on critical reflections on international support for LDCs. You have the floor, Daniel.
Thanks very much. I should say I was the advisor to the UN CDP till recently. I'm the former advisor. But anyway, still work closely with Jose Antonio.
But always an advisor.
Anyway, pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for listening. I told Susanna I'd stick to 6 minutes 59, and I will. I've started my watch. Okay, so my presentation is quite a general one, a bit different to most of the ones that have been made this morning and earlier. It's on a paper I wrote called A Critical Reflection on International Support for Least Developed Countries. It reflects, I suppose, my job over the last few years, which was to advise countries on the impact and the meaning of being a member of the LDC category and what it meant to graduate and how countries might themselves mitigate the impact of graduation. So I think sometimes programs of action and international initiatives can be general, set the tone, general framework, and so on. But really, where's the beef? What are the actual international support measures for LDCs? And they are threefold. You can categorize them into three headings. Firstly, trade, mostly duty-free, quota-free market access, and particularly the EBA scheme of the European Union. Secondly, official development assistance. And thirdly, support for participation in the intergovernmental process. So this is much smaller measures quite often, things like cheaper travel, free tickets to the General Assembly, things like that. And under ODA, we should also add the LDC fund for climate. So support, I am hypothesizing or suggesting, is based around the premise that LDCs are artificially or temporarily excluded from the global economy. Remove barriers, says the implicit underlying theory, provide temporary aid and help LDCs take part in the international system, and they'll catch up, hopefully. So to generalize, and this I know is perhaps a little bit controversial and certainly not explicitly stated, this is the underlying ethos of current international support measures for the least developed countries. Perhaps not intentionally, for whatever reason, but I would argue that that's the underlying theory. Has it worked? Well, as we've been hearing, performance has been mixed. I don't think we can say categorically that it has been a great success. We've fallen short of objectives. Lots of evidence has been put forward earlier about the shortfall. Actually, I wrote this paper before the pandemic, and even until early last year, there were signs of underperformance. For sure, some of the support measures are extremely helpful, pivotal maybe, in the success of certain LDCs. Duty-free, quota-free market access, particularly EBA, has benefited the likes of Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. But let's face it, as we heard earlier, ODA stagnated. Specific ODA to LDCs has actually fallen off a little bit over certain years recently. A few countries certainly progressed. Up to 12 countries might become eligible to leave the category in coming years, but some graduations have now been delayed, particularly as a result of the pandemic. This is a very brief summary of the long section in my paper about the performance of LDCs. I won't dwell on this bit, but clearly performance over the long term for LDCs has been unsatisfactory, I think you can say. There's no point in glossing it. Again, there's much more evidence presented in the paper. Trade as well has fallen short of objectives. We still remain in a situation of really high commodity dependence. This is something that hasn't come up over the last couple of days, but 85% of LDCs are classified as commodity dependent. Extreme commodity price volatility, particularly during the Istanbul Programme of Action relative to earlier years, remains a massive problem. And pivotally, I would say, and this is the subject of this session, there's been a capital shortfall. The ability of LDCs to accumulate capital, both foreign, domestic, from government and privately, has fallen short. The rate of gross fixed capital formation, which I think is a really pivotal statistic relative to GDP in LDCs, is short of what would be required for structural transformation. And Haijun Chang made this point quite eloquently in one or two of his books, and he'll speak next. Government revenue is quite low. So anyway, I posit some explanations for this underperformance broadly. There are theoretical and practical reasons for the shortcomings. So it's not only market access that's the challenge for LDCs. Even if LDCs were to fully participate in the global economic system via perfect market access, and certainly improvements can be made, and certainly that's an important source of support for the LDCs, they wouldn't catch up. Why? Exports are only a small part of the economy at the moment in LDCs, starting from way behind, structural inflexibilities that exist even in the developed world. Many LDCs are small and vulnerable and often remote, and they're operating, let's face it, we can't deny this, it's still true, perhaps more so than 20 years ago, in a global system of dependence. Some of the things that the early development theorists posited about the LDCs are still valid. So the implicit underpinnings of international support fall short. So what to do about it? I present quite an ambitious range of around 30 specific actionable ideas divided into 6 headings in the paper. And I'd urge you to read it and let me know what you think. Firstly, improve the international system. Secondly, further prioritize finance investment, a big thing. Thirdly, trade, coordinate commodity prices, resource flows, technology, climate breakdown, and environment. And the crucial thing is that what is needed is a coherent international architecture of support to the LDCs, less ad hocery and more systemic thinking underpinned by solid theoretical foundations. So I'm running out of time, but I guess to pick on one, I think that there can actually be better coordination of the UN system on the least developed countries. Certainly more disaggregation between types of LDC. So the graduating LDCs should receive support alongside the less developed ones. I don't know, I'm not going to talk too much about finance investment other than to say that donors consistently fail to meet their pledges on ODA, a percentage of GNI. There are certain very generous donors who consistently performed, of which Finland is certainly one. Others don't. Commodities and resources remain a massive issue. Anyway, to summarize, I've reached the end of my 7 minutes and wasn't really able to go into any detail on some of the specific ideas that are in the paper. But again, I would urge people to have a good look and let me know what you think. There's always controversy when you go into detail, but I think practical detail is really needed now ahead of the next program of action. We're beyond the theory and analysis. We need to really get down to brass tacks. And that's what I've tried to do in as comprehensive a way as possible. So the summary of the paper really is that LDC performance has fallen short of objectives. Whatever we're doing, we can do better. The theory and concepts behind international support need to be re-examined. LDC development is about more than just exposure to international markets, even if that were perfect, even if you got the prices right, even if trade preference schemes were perfectly designed. I mean, I can't count the number of times I've sat in an LDC government office and a senior official or minister or whoever has said, look, great, we have market access, but we don't make enough. The supply in our country is insufficient. And to some extent, this predates the existence of market access. There is an interaction between the two. So there is the requirement for sustainable productive capacity and explicit direct efforts also on behalf of the international community to build productive capacity. Industrial policy is back on the agenda, but not old-style vertical hard industrial policy, more soft, smart, forward-looking, strategic policies in a vertical sense. So progress implies a systemic push for better international support along at least 6 dimensions, and I mentioned them: the UN system, finance investment, commodities and resources, trade, technology, and climate change. Each of these interacts with one another as well. So anyway, the next program of action is an opportunity to start putting in place such a system. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And I think the last point you make about the integrated approach to support LDCs and the role of coordination, not only of the UN, but also of other development corporations, networks, for example, notably OECD, is quite important. And let me perhaps underscore in particular the point about the role of trade and trade preferences for LDCs, which is, of course, a major issue, and it's a major issue notably when countries graduate. I mean, for example, Bangladesh, the largest LDC who is graduating, will have certainly that problem. Having said that, let me give the floor back to Theo Jen, who is back online. You have the floor.
Yeah, we hear you. We are going to present from here, so you can just talk.
Merci.
Thank you. I'm from the University of Burundi, so this is the Burundi experience, the financing of micro enterprises in Burundi with a stress laid on microfinance. Indeed, the state in its development strategy has set up policies to foster the funding of this type of enterprise. Next one, please. One more. So with this strategy, the financing of micro enterprises, these are small units which can be a solution to fight poverty and also for job creation. Next one, please. So the state has developed policies for the support to microfinance for micro enterprises. And microfinance were considered part of productive credit, but this is what you see in the table. There has been a shift. Productive credit has dropped from 2012 to 2018. Next slide, please. So the question is, are the microfinance bodies truly helping the micro enterprises? Their objective is to support them, but in their portfolios they have fewer microcredits to fund than is needed. So the idea is to see what the difficulties are, the obstacles to financing, to try and set up policies. And there are several factors which explain the situation. The level of guarantee, for instance, the nature of the business. There is the lack of training. So there are quite a few problems which need to be solved, and we have data on this in these localities, and you see here the red dots. Next slide, please. So results show, well, there are interesting results following this analysis. Microfinance institutions fund more of the agro-pastoral businesses than others. But the support policies are such that the guarantees that can be offered are not always sufficient. If the richer micro enterprise, the easier it gets to attract the support. And requesting a loan increases the level of training of the micro entrepreneur, because so to facilitate, to strengthen the funding in the Burundi case, we suggested that a platform be set up and the micro enterprises could be registered there. Those who are supported by the state, those who are supported by public finance, those that are supported by microfinance. And then there are the micro credits, especially for the non-agricultural sector. And at national level, there would be a coordination committee involving all of the players for the microfinancing of micro enterprises. And such a committee could, for instance, offer training, support, advisory services with people who could guide the micro entrepreneurs, most of whom are in the agricultural sector. And this could improve the financing of micro enterprises. To conclude, I could say that micro enterprises are better financed in trade than they are in the agricultural sector. So the guaranteed loans stand a better chance of obtaining funding. And there are tools that can be used to improve the financing of micro enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have certainly addressed a crucial issue, but also a very challenging one, given the fact that this issue of microfinance is even a very serious problem in middle-income countries. So it's, of course, an even greater challenge. And the focus on agriculture, I actually find to be correct. So that by the way, given the share of small producers in agriculture. Anyway, we have a very limited time, but maybe we can accept 2 or 3 questions, but I don't see any in the chat. I don't know if Minerva has a...
We do have some questions in the room. We have
okay.
two
So let's give
here.
the floor to... okay. Let's give the floor then to 3 questions.
My name is Cecilia McGill. My name is Cecilia McGill. And I have a question to Ms. Maria Anna, reversing the trend that leaves the LDCs, you hold it, LDCs behind. Thanks for the statistics. And my question is, are there any best practices that the mechanism that you have to extend the best practices to the LDCs, especially on a bilateral basis? And the next one is, on your statistics, do you have any KPIs that we can learn from in terms of progress? Thank you.
Mariana, you have the floor for
Oh, sorry, we
answer.
collect a few questions and then get back. I'm sorry, we don't have much time.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I want to congratulate all the panelists for their presentation. So I have, let's say, 3 main questions. Thank you. So the first one is to Pierre. So, j'aimerais savoir, bon, il y a des récentes études qui montrent que les réformes sur les produits toxiques, peut-être, disons l'alcool, le sucre, le tabac,
goods, alcohol, tobacco. A recent study in the UK recently showed that higher taxes, higher VAT on sugar improves the well-being of the population. So rather than implement what is imposed, why not suggest rather than reducing VAT on processing, why not increase VAT on what I might call toxic products?
Je vous remercie de m'accorder la parole.
Okay, is there a third question from the floor?
Yes, 2 more questions from the floor.
Je vous remercie de m'accorder la parole.
Well, thank you for giving me the floor. Zefirina Tonga is my name. First of all, I should like to thank all the panelists for their most interesting presentations. And I should like to share a consideration with all of the panelists. If you look at things, what you see is that the main challenge for LDCs is the development programs. The agriculture sector, more often than not, lacks processing plants. And in order to pick up on the presentations, there are LDCs that receive support and others that don't. So there are inequalities in terms of access to finance. There are also some differences. And there are those LDCs that are graduating and have to face a lot of transformations, and there are those which have to bear a very heavy debt burden. Do you not feel then that, as was just said, should we not rethink the strategies and not just focus on philosophical and theoretical considerations, which are sometimes limiting? Should we not rather look at practical and actionable proposals in favor?
Question, I'm sorry, we are running out of time.
Okay, final question.
My name is J. Wellington Baju I from Liberia. So my question goes to the presenter on reversing trend that leave LDC behind. I did not hear you mention anything about governance. And we are all aware that most LDCs are left behind because of poor governance. The next question is that, do we actually need financial support to transform LDCs? I think in the absence of financial support, if LDCs are committed, they are able to transform their own development. Because if you look at the resource endowment in LDCs, you find out that they constitute greater percentage of the total world resources, but those resources are not being used adequately. So the support, in my view, from the developed countries should be in terms of technical assistance to be able to negotiate concessions, that will benefit these LDCs. A classic case is Liberia. During the past regime, our president signed 64 concession agreements, and study shows that only 3 of those concession agreements actually benefited the country, and the remaining either benefited the foreign direct investors or the elite politicians.
Thank you so much, and apologies, we can't take any more questions. And Professor Ocampo, back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, we have to finish in, well, we had to finish in 1 minute, but we'll take a few more minutes. And let me first so answers of at most 1 minute, please. Mariana first.
Very much for your comments. Quick reactions. In terms of mechanisms that extend best practices LDCs. So I think what we try to do in this presentation is to advocate for ODA, which is a very scarce resource, but also the largest one in LDCs, to actually be better target to LDCs and of course areas within LDCs that need special attention, basic services and like areas like health and education. And I take very much the point on the governance and the fact that there is much, there should be a focus there, and of course the need for technical assistance to actually provide some input into that. And it's not only about financial support, so points well taken, but we see a gap on the financing that needs addressing, and it still only represents a small amount of financing going to LDC. So the more we can do at that front to start with, the best. So over to you, Alice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The second question was on VAT. So Pierre, do you have some comments on that?
Thank you, Chair. Par rapport à cette question, je pense qu'effectivement, on pourrait taxer davantage les produits dits toxiques. Mais après, ce qu'il faudrait faire attention, c'est que la plupart de ces produits dits toxiques sont des produits qui sont importés.
Yes, indeed, I believe we could
On pourrait se retrouver en porte-à-faux.
impose a tax on toxic products, but most of them are imported, so we would have to comply with the WTO rules, and they want to maintain some kind of balance, but it is an interesting option indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me say the last two questions were somewhat broader. So let me actually give the floor in the following order. First to Olivier, second to Daniel, and finally Sanetta, to see if you have questions or comments about the agriculture part. Yeah. So Olivier, go ahead.
Just one brief comment on the last question. I mean, on governance and its importance. I think recently I had a question from one of our delegates who was saying, as we were developing new instruments, I mean, to de-risk investment in LDCs and other countries, whether that would be enough, I mean, to create incentives for the companies to invest there. And obviously we see, for instance, for blended finance that only 6% is in LDCs, so that's very little. So my answer was definitely not. I mean, instruments are not enough, and we need to work, I mean, on the enabling environment, I mean, to make the country more attractive. That's investment climate, private sector development and engagement. And also we need to work together with other actors, public and private, and to have the business strategies include more inclusiveness and the SDGs in their strategies. So just that was a brief point on that question. Thanks.
Thank you. Daniel?
I think not much time really, but to reiterate the call for a systematic approach to the next program of action, with perhaps the idea of this umbrella agreement on improving sustainable productive capacity and reorientation of the program towards direct support for improving productive capacities at the national levels, but according to context and avoiding this idea of sort of one size fits all, in order to complement the sort of the gains that have been made so far over the last 10 years. But really, I think again, to raise in priority this idea of the direct stimulation of productive capacity for export and domestically. Thanks.
Very good, Sanetta.
And food sector is very important in a sense that this is definitely a very critical sector, both from the perspective of just simply food security and hunger reduction, but also income and livelihoods. I think the problem we have so far is that we usually look at the issue just from a one-sided perspective. So for a very long time, it was only agricultural production. Now there is much more emphasis on post-production part of the food value chains. However, the two cannot exist without the second part, right? So we really need probably this more global perspective on food production in general, and maybe more integrated approach. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just take 1 minute to, first of all, to thank the office in charge of least developed countries in the United Nations, which we work very closely together. All panelists for the presentations, which have been covered, part of the broader range of issues that both international and domestic that are crucial in terms of financing. I mean, the ODA, the debt issues, the questions of trade rules for LDCs, and then at the domestic level, the issue of agriculture, which is quite crucial, and let me say microfinance, which also cover fiscal resources, with the VAT having been covered in this presentation. And let me perhaps end up with reinforcing a comment that Daniel made, which has been a central point for the Committee for Development Policy, which is developing productive capacities has to be the main objective of the next 10 years of actions on LDCs. With that, let me again thank all of you, and thank the Office of Least Developed countries and other countries in a special situation for the presentations. Excuse me, for convening this meeting. It has been a great pleasure being with all of you. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Professor Ocampo and all the panelists, and apologies for being a bit strict on time for this session. We will now continue immediately with the keynote speech by Professor Ha-Joon Chang. So please don't leave the room, those who are in here. Thank you so much.